The night air around Fort Sentinel was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that only existed on military bases after midnight. Floodlights illuminated the main entrance gate while two armed guards stood inside the small security booth watching the empty road stretch into the darkness. Private Lewis leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee while staring at the monitor that displayed feeds from the perimeter cameras. "Nothing again," he muttered. Across from him, Corporal Hayes shrugged. "It's midnight. What do you expect? A parade?" Lewis yawned. "I expect something more exciting than checking empty roads for 8 hours." The radio crackled briefly with routine chatter from another checkpoint on the far side of the base. Hayes glanced at the clock on the wall. 2 more hours, Lewis groaned. Feels like 10. Outside, the wind rustled the tall fence that surrounded the base, making a faint metallic sound that echoed in the quiet night. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. Lewis sat up slightly. Well, finally. A single vehicle was approaching slowly down the long road toward the checkpoint. Hayes grabbed the binoculars and looked out through the glass window. Civilian USV. Lewis tapped a button and the gate barrier remained lowered. The vehicle rolled to a stop under the bright overhead lights. Inside sat a woman in her early 30s wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. Lewis stepped outside and approached the driver's window. "Evening, ma'am." The woman rolled down the window calmly. "Good evening." "Your identification, please?" She reached into her pocket and handed him a small ID card. Lewis took it and glanced at the name. Avery Carter. He scanned the card briefly before looking back at her. "You're trying to enter Fort Sentinel?" "Yes." "At midnight?" "Yes." Lewis chuckled lightly. "Do you have clearance?" "Yes." Hayes stepped outside the booth and joined them. Lewis handed him the ID. Hayes examined it carefully. "Contractor?" Avery nodded. "Temporary clearance." Hayes smirked slightly. "Temporary clearance doesn't usually show up at midnight." Avery's voice stayed calm. "I was told to report tonight." Lewis leaned slightly against the vehicle door. "Well, whoever told you that forgot to tell us." Hayes handed the ID back through the window. "You'll have to come back in the morning." Avery didn't take the ID immediately. "I can't." Lewis laughed. "Everyone says that." She looked at him quietly. "My orders were very clear." Hayes crossed his arms. "Orders from who?" Avery reached into her jacket pocket again. "Command." She placed a small coin on the dashboard between them. Lewis glanced at it casually, then paused. Hayes leaned closer. "What's that supposed to be?" Lewis picked up the coin. It was heavy, metal. One side showed a detailed emblem engraved into the surface, the Ranger tab. The other side carried an insignia few soldiers ever saw up close. Lewis frowned. "Nice souvenir," Hayes chuckled. "Army gift shop?" Avery remained silent. Lewis turned the coin over again. "Look, ma'am, we see these all the time. People collect military stuff." Hayes added jokingly, "Yeah, my uncle's got one from a poker game." Lewis tossed the coin lightly back onto the dashboard. "Still doesn't get you into the base." Avery finally spoke again. "Are you sure about that?" Hayes shrugged. "Pretty sure." Lewis nodded. "Positive." For a moment, Avery simply looked at them. Then she reached forward and slid the coin slightly closer to Lewis again. "Take a better look." Lewis rolled his eyes but picked it up again. This time, he noticed something different. A small engraved code near the edge. His smile faded slightly. "What's this?" Hayes leaned closer. "Probably decorative." Lewis turned the coin under the floodlight. The engraving wasn't decorative. It was a verification code, and not a normal one. Lewis felt his stomach tighten slightly. "Hey, Hayes." "Yeah?" "You seen one of these before?" Hayes squinted. "Looks like a Ranger coin." Lewis lowered his voice. "No, look at the code." Hayes leaned closer. The numbers suddenly looked familiar. Too familiar. His expression changed immediately. "Wait." Lewis looked back at Avery slowly. "You mind telling us where you got this?" She answered simply, "It was issued to me." Hayes shook his head. "That code, that's command level." Lewis suddenly realized something. He turned the coin over again and noticed a second engraving on the edge,
a small symbol. His heart skipped. Hayes, what? That's not just a Ranger coin. Hayes looked again. His face went pale. Oh. Lewis slowly handed the coin back to Avery. You should have said something. Avery placed the cap back in her pocket. I tried. Hayes suddenly rushed back into the security booth. Lewis heard him grabbing the radio. What are you doing? Lewis asked. Hayes spoke into the radio quickly. Gate 1 to command. We have a priority code verification at the main entrance. Static crackled. Then a voice responded. Repeat that? Hayes glanced nervously at the SUV outside. Priority code verification, Ranger authorization. There was a long pause on the radio. Then the voice returned. Stand by. Lewis looked back at Avery. You're telling me that coin is real? Yes. And that code? Yes. Lewis swallowed hard. A moment later, the radio exploded with activity. Multiple voices speaking at once. Then a loud alarm suddenly echoed across the entire base. Lewis jumped. What did you just trigger? Floodlights across the perimeter suddenly switched on. Barracks lights flickered awake. Sirens began blaring in the distance. Lewis stared at the base behind him. What did you just trigger? Hayes rushed back outside the booth. Basewide lockdown. Lewis's eyes widened. For a coin? Hayes shook his head. Not just a coin. A convoy of military vehicles was already racing across the base toward the front gate. Lewis looked back at Avery. You're not just a contractor, are you? She didn't answer. The vehicles arrived seconds later. Several armed soldiers jumped out and quickly secured the area. One of them approached the SUV. Ma'am? Avery opened the door and stepped out. Lewis immediately stood straight. The soldier saluted her sharply. Sorry for the delay. She nodded. No problem. Lewis looked completely confused. Wait, who is she? The soldier turned towards him. You didn't recognize the coin? Lewis shook his head slowly. No. The soldier looked back at Avery with clear respect. That's a Ranger command coin. Lewis blinked. So? The soldier continued quietly. There are only 12 of those in circulation. Lewis felt the weight of that sentence sink in. And each one, the soldier continued, triggers immediate base lockdown verification if presented at a military gate. Lewis stared at Avery. So when we scanned that code, the soldier nodded. You alerted command that one of the Rangers had arrived. Lewis swallowed hard. You mean? Avery placed her cap back in her pocket. Yes. Lewis exhaled slowly. The guards who had been joking with her only minutes earlier now stood silently, because the midnight visitor they had mocked at the gate had just shut down the entire base with a single coin.